Maid's daughter spilled tea on the Arab prince during a banquet. His reaction stunned everyone. The crystal chandeliers of the royal palace of Al-Nazra cast dancing light across the marble floors, their golden glow reflecting off silverware arranged with mathematical precision on tables draped in burgundy silk. Tonight was no ordinary evening. It was the state banquet celebrating the diplomatic alliance between the Kingdom of Al-Nazra and the European coalition, an event that had taken 6 months to orchestrate and would be attended by dignitaries from 17 nations. In the palace's vast kitchen, 17-year-old Layla Hassan stood trembling, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white beneath her brown skin. She wore the crisp uniform of the palace serving staff, a modest black dress with a white apron, her dark hair pulled back into a severe bun that made her look older than her years. But nothing could hide the terror in her dark eyes as she stared at the gleaming silver tea service she'd been entrusted to carry. "You'll be fine, Habibti," whispered her mother, Amina, the head maid who had served the royal family for 23 years. Amina's weathered hands adjusted Layla's collar with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dressed 1,000 nervous servers. "Just remember, approach from the left, pour from the right, never turn your back to royalty, and for heaven's sake don't make eye contact with Prince Rashid unless he addresses you first." Layla nodded mutely, her throat too tight to form words. She had begged her mother not to make her serve tonight, pleaded to remain in the kitchen washing dishes or polishing silver, anything but this. But 3 servers had fallen ill with food poisoning from a bad batch of fish at lunch, and the palace was desperately short-staffed. Her mother had no choice but to press her shy, clumsy daughter into service for the most important banquet of the decade. "I can't do this, Mama," Layla whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll ruin everything. You know how I am." Amina's expression softened, and for a moment she wasn't the formidable head maid, but simply a mother worried for her child. "You're stronger than you know, ya binti. Just breathe. I believe in you." The orchestra began playing, a signal that the dignitaries were taking their seats. Layla lifted the tea service, its weight surprising her, and followed the line of servers through the kitchen doors into the grand banquet hall. The hall was magnificent beyond description, with soaring ceilings painted with scenes from Al-Nazra's glorious history, columns of rose-veined marble, and tables arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central dance floor. At the head table, elevated slightly above the others, sat Prince Rashid bin Abdullah al-Nasra, the crown prince of Al-Nazra and the kingdom's most beloved figure. At 32, Prince Rashid was striking rather than conventionally handsome, with a strong jaw, intelligent dark eyes, and the bearing of someone born to leadership. He wore traditional formal attire, a pristine white thobe embroidered at the collar with golden thread, a black and gold-trimmed bisht draped over his shoulders, and a white gutra secured with a golden agal. Everything about him radiated authority, but those who knew him well spoke of his kindness, his progressive policies that had modernized Al-Nazra's economy, and his genuine concern for even the poorest of his subjects. Layla's hands began to shake as she approached the head table. She could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, could hear the whispered conversations in a dozen languages, could smell the exotic perfumes and the rich aromas of the feast. The tea service suddenly felt impossibly heavy, the silver scalding hot beneath her fingers despite the cloth wrapped around the handle. She approached the table from the left, just as her mother had instructed, moving toward the British ambassador first. The elderly diplomat smiled kindly at her as she poured, her hand steadying slightly with this small success. Then the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, then the German Chancellor's representative, and then Prince Rashid himself. Layla's heart hammered so violently she was certain everyone could hear it. She moved to stand beside the prince, her eyes fixed firmly on the delicate porcelain cup before him. The cup was part of a set that dated back 4 generations, painted with intricate patterns of peacocks and roses, each one worth more than her mother earned in a year. "Good evening," Prince Rashid said quietly, his voice warm and unexpectedly gentle. The sound startled her. She hadn't expected him to speak to her, hadn't prepared for the simple humanity of his greeting. Her eyes flickered up to meet his for just a fraction of a second, and she saw not the imperious royal she'd feared, but a man with laugh lines around his eyes and an encouraging smile. Good evening, Your Royal Highness," she stammered, then immediately cursed herself for speaking when she should have simply nodded. She began to pour, tilting the teapot with excessive caution. The amber liquid flowed smoothly into the cup, steam rising in delicate spirals. She was going to succeed. She was going to prove her mother's faith in her was justified. And then disaster struck. Someone at the far end of the hall dropped a tray of glasses. The crash was explosive in the elegant quiet of the banquet, a cacophony of shattering crystal that made everyone jump. Layla startled violently, her grip on the teapot faltering for just a moment. But a moment was all it took. The teapot tipped, and suddenly boiling tea was cascading not into the cup, but directly onto Prince Rashid's lap, soaking through his pristine white thobe, spreading across the expensive fabric in a dark, damning stain. The prince jerked backward with a sharp intake of breath, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The hall fell into a silence so absolute that Layla could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. 300 people held their breath, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. The orchestra's music stumbled to a discordant halt. Layla stood paralyzed, the teapot still in her hands, horror washing over her in waves. She had just assaulted the crown prince of Al-Nasra. She had burned him, humiliated him in front of the world's diplomatic elite, ruined the most important event of the year. She would be dismissed. Her mother would be dismissed. They would lose their housing in the palace quarters, would be turned out with nothing, blacklisted from royal service forever. Tears sprang to her eyes as she finally found her voice. "Your Royal Highness, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. Please, I'm so—" She was vaguely aware of palace guards moving toward her, of her mother's stricken face visible in the doorway to the kitchen, of the British ambassador rising from his seat with a look of scandalized shock, of cameras from the press section clicking furiously to capture this unprecedented breach of protocol. Prince Rashid stood, dabbing at his soaked thobe with a napkin. Every eye in the room was fixed upon him, waiting to see how he would react to this public humiliation, waiting for his anger, for his command to have this clumsy girl dragged away and punished. Instead, he smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm and without a trace of irritation, and it transformed his face completely. He looked directly at Layla, who was now openly crying, her whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. "Please, don't distress yourself," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the silent hall. Accidents happen to the best of us. I myself once spilled an entire pot of coffee on the Japanese ambassador during a trade negotiation. These things occur. A ripple of uncertain laughter spread through the crowd, but Layla could only stare at him in disbelief. Prince Rashid gestured to one of his advisers. Please ensure that this young woman is not reprimanded in any way for this incident. It was purely accidental, and I will not have her career jeopardized over a simple mishap. He turned back to Layla, his expression kind. What is your name? Layla Hassan, Your Royal Highness. She managed to choke out through her tears. Miss Hassan, I accept your apology, though none was necessary. Please, try not to worry. No harm has been done that a change of clothes cannot fix. He nodded to her mother, who stood frozen in the doorway. Mrs. Hassan, I presume? Your daughter shows promise. Please continue her training. I suspect she will become an excellent member of our staff once she conquers her nerves. With that, he excused himself briefly to change, and the banquet continued, though the whispers about the prince's extraordinary grace under pressure would dominate conversations for the rest of the evening. Layla assumed that would be the end of it, a humiliating story she would carry for the rest of her life, but at least she and her mother had kept their positions. She returned to her usual duties in the palace's lower floors, polishing silver and washing linens, carefully keeping to the shadows whenever she saw the prince in the corridors. But 3 weeks after the banquet, her mother summoned her to the head maid's office with an expression Layla couldn't read. "Sit down, Layla," Amina said, gesturing to a chair. Her voice was strange, thick with an emotion Layla couldn't identify. "What's wrong? Have I done something?" Her mother shook her head, then handed Layla an envelope of creamy paper, sealed with the royal crest. "This came for you this morning, from Prince Rashid's private secretary." With trembling fingers, Layla broke the seal and extracted a letter written in elegant Arabic script. As she read, her eyes grew wider and wider, until she had to read it 3 times to believe what she was seeing. The letter informed her that Prince Rashid had established an educational trust in her name. The trust would cover her tuition, books, housing, and living expenses to attend any university she chose, in any field of study she desired. There was only one condition, that she work hard and make the most of the opportunity she'd been given. "I don't understand," Layla whispered. "Why would he do this?" Her mother was crying openly now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Because he is a good man, Habibti. Because you showed him vulnerability and honesty, and he chose to respond with generosity rather than anger. Because this is what true leadership looks like." That night, Layla lay awake in the small room she shared with her mother in the palace quarters, staring at the ceiling and trying to comprehend how her life had just transformed. She had always loved learning, had excelled in the limited schooling available to her before financial necessity forced her to leave and help her mother with work. She had dreamed of becoming a doctor, of understanding the intricate machinery of the human body, but had dismissed such dreams as impossible fantasies. Now, impossibly, they might become real. She thought of Prince Rashid's kind eyes, his gentle voice telling her not to distress herself. She had been so certain he would be angry, would see her as nothing more than a clumsy servant who had embarrassed him. Instead, he had seen her, truly seen her, and chosen compassion. In that moment, Layla made a silent promise to herself and to the prince who had changed her life. She would work harder than anyone had ever worked before. She would justify his faith in her. She would make herself into someone who could make a difference in the world. She would find a way somehow to repay his kindness. Layla chose to study biochemistry at the Royal University of Al-Nazra, focusing specifically on toxicology, the science of poisons and antidotes. Her professors were initially skeptical of this shy, soft-spoken girl from the palace kitchens, but their doubts evaporated during her first semester when she achieved the highest marks in the entire freshman class. She was driven by something more than ordinary ambition. Every time she felt exhausted, every time organic chemistry equations swam before her bleary eyes at 3 in the morning, every time she wanted to give up, she thought of Prince Rashid's smile at the banquet. She thought of the tea soaking into his thobe, and his response, not anger, but grace. Such kindness deserved to be honored, and the only way she knew how was through excellence. Her focus on toxicology was both practical and personal. Al-Nazra, despite its wealth and modernization, still struggled with cases of accidental poisoning, industrial accidents, agricultural pesticides, contaminated food supplies. Layla saw toxicology as a way to protect people, to save lives, to serve her kingdom in a meaningful way. By her third year, she was publishing research papers that caught international attention. Her work on identifying novel antidotes for organophosphate compounds earned her a scholarship to pursue graduate studies at Oxford University, and her mother cried with joy when Layla called to share the news. "The prince asks about you sometimes," Amina told her during one of their weekly phone calls. "He wants to know how you're progressing." Layla felt her cheeks warm. "What do you tell him? The truth? That you're brilliant? That you're making our entire family proud? That his investment in you was the wisest thing he ever did?" At Oxford, Layla's research took a darker turn. She became fascinated by the poisonings of political figures throughout history, the murders disguised as accidents, the sophisticated compounds designed to evade detection, the constant arms race between poisoners and toxicologists. Her doctoral thesis focused on identifying trace amounts of rare toxic compounds in biological samples, developing new methods to detect poisons that conventional tests missed. She studied the case of Alexander Litvinenko and polonium-210, the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal with Novichok nerve agents, the ricin poisoning of Georgy Markov. She learned to recognize the signatures of dozens of exotic poisons: thallium, aconite, tetrodotoxin, saxitoxin, palytoxin, and countless others. "Why this morbid focus?" her thesis advisor, Professor Margaret Chen, asked during one of their meetings. "You have the talent to pursue any subspecialty in toxicology. Why political assassinations?" Layla had thought carefully about her answer. "Because the people who use these poisons are often targeting leaders, people whose deaths can destabilize entire nations, trigger wars, destroy peace. If I can become expert enough to recognize these compounds and develop antidotes, I might be able to prevent such catastrophes." What she didn't say was that she sometimes had nightmares about Prince Rashid, the man who had saved her life by saving her future, being targeted by such an attack. The nightmares made no rational sense. Al-Nazra was stable, prosperous, at peace with its neighbors. But still, the fear lingered. She earned her doctorate at 27, the youngest person in her program to do so. She was immediately offered positions at prestigious research institutions in London, Geneva, and Washington, but she turned them all down. "I'm going home," she told Professor Chen. "My kingdom gave me this education. Now I need to give back." She returned to Al-Nasra to find a nation transformed. Prince Rashid had recently ascended to the throne following his father's peaceful retirement, and King Rashid, as he was now called, had accelerated his modernization programs. New hospitals, new schools, new research facilities. He had specifically requested the construction of a world-class toxicology center to be directed by Dr. Layla Hassan. When Layla received the official appointment letter, she wept, overwhelmed by the symmetry of it all. 10 years ago, she had spilled tea on a prince. Now, that same prince, now king, had entrusted her with leading a national research institution. She threw herself into the work with characteristic intensity, building a team of talented researchers, establishing protocols, creating a database of toxic compounds found in the region. The Rashid Center for Toxicological Research quickly gained an international reputation for excellence. And then, 13 years after the spilled tea incident, King Rashid announced he would be hosting an international summit on regional cooperation, a gathering of leaders from 23 nations to discuss trade, environmental protection, and mutual defense. The summit would be held at the Royal Palace's new conference center, a stunning building of glass and steel that somehow managed to honor traditional Al-Nasra architecture while embracing modernity. Security was unprecedented, with background checks on every staff member, screening procedures that rivaled those of international airports, and cooperation from intelligence agencies across the region. But in the weeks leading up to the summit, Layla felt a growing unease she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the nervous energy infecting the entire capital city. Perhaps it was the increased security presence, the helicopters circling overhead, the bomb-sniffing dogs and armed guards at every entrance. Or perhaps it was something deeper, an instinct born from years of studying how people with power could become targets. She mentioned her concerns to her mother, who still served as head maid at the palace despite her advancing age. "You worried too much, Habibdi," Amina said, though her smile was strained. "The security is tighter than anything I've ever seen. Nothing could possibly go wrong." But something in her mother's voice suggested she didn't entirely believe her own reassurance. The summit began on a crisp October morning, with delegations arriving in motorcades, flags snapping in the breeze, and carefully scripted greetings exchanged on the palace steps. Layla watched on television from her laboratory, seeing King Rashid, older now, with threads of silver in his beard, but with the same kind eyes she remembered, welcome each leader personally. The first 2 days proceeded flawlessly. Agreements were signed, joint statements issued, friendships renewed. Al-Nasra's reputation as a force for stability and cooperation in a turbulent region was enhanced with every successful session. On the third night, there would be a state dinner, not as elaborate as the banquet 13 years ago, but still a significant diplomatic event. Leaders would gather for a meal, showcasing Al-Nasra's cuisine and hospitality, followed by entertainment and informal networking. Layla had been invited as one of the kingdom's notable scientific figures, though she found the prospect terrifying. She would be back in that banquet hall, the scene of her greatest humiliation and her life's great turning point. And this time, she would be attending as a guest, not a server. She chose her outfit carefully, a modest but elegant dress in deep blue, her hair styled professionally, minimal jewelry. As she prepared, she thought about what she might say if King Rashid spoke to her. Would he even remember her? Surely a king had more important things to occupy his memory than a clumsy girl who once spilled tea. The dinner was held in the same grand banquet hall, though it had been updated with modern lighting and acoustics. Layla found herself seated at a table with other scientists and academics, far from the head table where King Rashid sat surrounded by world leaders. The meal proceeded through multiple courses: traditional mezze, lamb prepared 3 different ways, delicate rice dishes flavored with saffron and rose water, desserts that were works of art. Conversation flowed easily, lubricated by sparkling water and fruit juices. Al-Nazra's state dinners were alcohol-free, honoring Islamic traditions. Layla had just finished her dessert when she noticed something odd. At the head table, King Rashid had paused mid-conversation with the Turkish president, his hand at his throat. She watched as he reached for his water glass and drank deeply, then shook his head slightly as if to clear it. Probably nothing. Perhaps a bit of food caught in his throat, but something made her continue watching. The king set down his water glass and attempted to continue the conversation, but his face had gone pale. He blinked several times rapidly, and his hand trembled as he reached for his napkin. Then, in a movement that sent ice through Layla's veins, he pushed back from the table and attempted to stand, only to stumble, catching himself on the chair. Layla was on her feet before conscious thought caught up with her actions. She recognized those symptoms: the sudden onset, the tremor, the pallor, the loss of coordination. She had seen them documented in countless case studies, had studied the progression in videos and reports. Poisoning, chemical poisoning, something that acted quickly but hadn't killed immediately, which suggested either a miscalculated dose or a compound designed to simulate natural illness. She was running toward the head table even as security personnel surrounded the king. She heard shouts of, "Doctor!" and "Call an ambulance!" and "Clear the room!" But she pushed through, her scientific training overriding her natural shyness. "I'm Dr. Hassan, toxicologist," she shouted at the security guard who tried to block her path. "Let me through." "Ma'am, please step back. I'm the director of the Rashid Center for Toxicological Research, and your king has been poisoned. Let me through now, or you're going to watch him die." The authority in her voice, so unlike her usual soft-spoken manner, made the guard hesitate just long enough for her to slip past. King Rashid was now on the floor, surrounded by panicked advisors. His breathing was labored, his pupils constricted to pinpoints, his skin taking on a grayish hue. He was conscious but clearly struggling, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Layla dropped to her knees beside him, her mind racing through differentials. Quick onset, respiratory distress, meiosis, gray skin, tremors, no obvious convulsions yet, which ruled out some compounds, but not others. "Your Majesty," she said urgently, her hands already checking his pulse, rapid and thready. "Can you hear me?" He managed a slight nod, his eyes focusing on her with obvious difficulty. "I need to know exactly what you ate and drank in the last 30 minutes. Can you remember?" One of the advisors spoke up, his voice shaking. "He had the same meal as everyone else, nothing different." "Then it was targeted poisoning, added specifically to his plate or glass," Layla said sharply. She looked back at the king. "Your Majesty, Was there anything that tasted unusual, bitter, metallic? He managed to whisper, "The fish? Bitter. The fish coarse." Layla's mind raced. Bitter taste suggested alkaloids, fast-acting, cardiovascular, and respiratory effects. The combination of symptoms was starting to form a pattern, and the pattern made her blood run cold. "I need his plate, his utensils, his glass, everything on the table sealed immediately for analysis," she commanded. "And I need an ambulance with full cardiac support now. We're dealing with either aconitine or a related alkaloid compound." Aconitine, derived from the monkshood plant, sometimes called the queen of poisons for its deadly efficiency. It caused cardiac arrhythmias, respiratory paralysis, and had no specific antidote, only supportive care and time if the dose wasn't too large. But even as she said it, something felt wrong. Aconitine's progression was usually faster, more dramatic. This was similar, but not identical. A variant? A synthesized analog designed to confuse diagnosis? The king's breathing was becoming more labored, his lips taking on a bluish tinge. They were running out of time. "Get him on his side, maintain his airway," she ordered, and the security personnel, recognizing expertise when they heard it, followed her commands without question. When the medical team arrives, they need to initiate supportive cardiac care immediately. Atropine for the bradycardia, activated charcoal if we're within the window, continuous cardiac monitoring. As if summoned by her words, Palace medical staff arrived with a gurney and emergency equipment. Layla quickly briefed them on her assessment, and they began treatment, even as they loaded the king for transport. "I'm coming with you," Layla announced, climbing into the ambulance before anyone could protest. She looked at the lead physician. "I know this compound. I've studied it. You need me." In the ambulance, racing toward the Royal Hospital with sirens wailing, Layla held an oxygen mask over the king's face while the medical team worked to stabilize his erratic heart rhythm. She watched his vital signs on the monitors, her trained eye catching every dangerous fluctuation. "Stay with us, Your Majesty," she murmured. "I need you to fight this. Your kingdom needs you to fight this." His eyes opened slightly, and for just a moment, through the fog of poison and pain, he seemed to see her clearly. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been a smile. "The tea-girl," he whispered. At the Royal Hospital, the best medical facility in the region, King Rashid was rushed into the intensive care unit while Layla commandeered a laboratory. The samples from his plate and glass had been carefully transported in sealed containers, and she set to work with an intensity that bordered on frenzy. Standard toxicology screens would take hours and might miss exotic compounds entirely. But Layla had spent a decade preparing for exactly this scenario: political assassination by poison. She had developed rapid screening protocols specifically designed to identify rare compounds that conventional tests would miss. She ran the samples through gas chromatography mass spectrometry, her eyes glued to the readouts as peaks and valleys formed patterns that told her the chemical story of what had been used to try to kill her king. The spectrum that emerged made her catch her breath. Not aconitine, pseudaconitine, a related but even more deadly alkaloid, typically derived from a different species of aconitum plant found in the Himalayas. It was rarer, harder to detect, and had a slightly different symptom profile that could easily be mistaken for a heart attack in anyone who wasn't specifically looking for poisoning. But there was something else in the spectrum, too. additional peaks that didn't fit the standard pseudaconitine profile. She zoomed in, ran additional tests, cross-referenced her databases, and then she understood. This wasn't naturally derived pseudaconitine. This was a synthesized variant, modified at the molecular level to be more potent and harder to identify. Whoever had done this was extremely sophisticated, with access to advanced chemical synthesis capabilities and detailed knowledge of toxicology. This was the work of a professional, a state-level assassin, not some amateur with a grudge. The good news was that her analysis gave her detailed information about exactly what was attacking the King system. The bad news was that there was no established antidote for this specific variant. She would have to create one, and she would have to do it fast. She called her research team at the Rashid Center, waking them in the middle of the night. "Get to the lab immediately. We have a Code Black situation." Code Black was the protocol they had established for exactly this scenario: poison-based assassination attempt on a high-value target. Her team had practiced it in drills, but none of them had believed they would ever actually need to use it. Within 30 minutes, her 5 top researchers had assembled at the hospital laboratory. Layla quickly briefed them on the situation, showing them the spectral analysis and the molecular structure she had identified. "The poison is attacking the sodium channels in his cardiac tissue," she explained, sketching rapidly on a whiteboard. "It's causing uncontrolled electrical activity in the heart, leading to potentially fatal arrhythmias. We need to design a binding agent that can sequester the compound and a pharmacological intervention that can stabilize the sodium channels until his body can metabolize and eliminate the toxin." Dr. Youssef Karim, her senior researcher, looked at the molecular structure with widening eyes. "Layla, synthesizing a specific binding agent could take days, even weeks. We don't have that kind of time." "Then we don't synthesize from scratch," she replied. "We modify something that already exists. Find me every compound in our database that has a similar molecular geometry. We're going to find something that can grab this poison and hold on to it long enough to reduce the active concentration in his bloodstream." They worked through the night, running simulations, testing combinations, rejecting ideas that didn't meet their stringent requirements. Layla was everywhere at once, checking data, reviewing calculations, offering suggestions, pushing her team to move faster, think more creatively, refused to accept that failure was possible. In the ICU 2 floors above them, King Rashid's condition was deteriorating. The medical team kept him alive through sheer force of will and technological intervention. Medications to stabilize his heart rhythm, a ventilator to support his failing respiratory system, continuous dialysis to help clear toxins from his blood. But everyone knew these were temporary measures. Without a specific antidote, the king was on borrowed time. As dawn broke over Al-Nazra, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Layla finally had a candidate, a modified form of a beta blocker combined with a chelating agent that had been originally developed for heavy metal poisoning, theoretically should bind to the pseudaconitine variant and reduce its bioavailability while simultaneously protecting the cardiac tissue from further damage. "It's not perfect," she admitted to her team, her voice hoarse from hours of non-stop talking. "The binding affinity is only about 65% of what I'd like, but it's the best option we have, and we're out of time." Dr. Karim looked at her seriously. You're asking to administer an untested compound to the king of Al-Nasra. If this goes wrong, if we do nothing, he dies within the next 12 hours. Layla interrupted, her exhaustion making her blunt. I've run every simulation our computers can handle. The compound is stable, the predicted interactions are manageable, and the theoretical efficacy is high. Yes, it's a risk, but it's a calculated risk, and it's the only chance he has. She went to the ICU to present her findings to Dr. Hamza al-Rashid, the king's personal physician and one of the most respected doctors in the kingdom. He listened carefully to her explanation, asked penetrating questions about her methodology and conclusions, and examined her data with the thoroughness of someone who understood that he held a life in his hands. Finally, he nodded. Your reasoning is sound, Dr. Hassan, and His Majesty's condition is indeed critical. We will proceed with your treatment protocol. There's one more thing, Layla said quietly. I need to be the one to administer it. This compound has never been used in humans. I need to monitor the effects in real time, adjust dosing if necessary, respond immediately to any unexpected reactions. This is my area of expertise, and His Majesty's survival may depend on split-second decisions that only I am trained to make. Dr. al-Rashid studied her for a long moment, seeing past the exhaustion and fear to the steel beneath. Very well, Dr. Hassan. He is in your hands. God willing, your years of study will prove equal to this task. Layla entered the ICU room where King Rashid lay surrounded by monitors and machines. His face was gray, his breathing assisted by a ventilator, his body fighting a battle at the cellular level that no amount of courage or will could win without help. She thought of the young prince who had smiled at a terrified girl and told her not to distress herself, who had transformed her life with an act of grace she could never fully repay. She couldn't let him die. With hands that were somehow steady despite the terror singing through her veins, she prepared the antidote compound, carefully calculating the dosage based on his weight, the estimated concentration of poison in his system, and the binding characteristics of her formula. She administered it through his IV line, then settled into a chair beside his bed to watch and wait. The first hour was agonizing. She monitored every vital sign, every heartbeat, every breath, watching for signs of improvement or, God forbid, adverse reactions to her compound. The other physicians and nurses moved quietly around her, checking their own monitors, adjusting medications, silently praying for a miracle. In the second hour, something changed. His heart rhythm, which had been chaotically irregular, began to show more normal patterns. His blood pressure, which had been dangerously low, started to climb toward acceptable ranges. His respiratory effort, which had been labored even with ventilator assistance, became easier, more natural. By the third hour, Dr. al-Rashid was smiling. It's working, Dr. Hassan. Your antidote is working. Layla couldn't smile back yet, couldn't allow herself to believe until she was certain. She continued her vigil, watching, waiting, checking blood tests every 30 minutes to track the concentration of poison in the king's system. And with each test, the levels dropped, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as her compound bound to the toxin and allowed the king's own metabolism to clear it from his body. 8 hours after administering the antidote, King Rashid opened his eyes. It took 3 more days before the doctors were confident that King Rashid was truly out of danger, that the poison had been fully cleared from his system, that no permanent damage had been done to his heart or other organs. During those 3 days, Layla never left the hospital, catching brief naps in a chair by his bedside, eating whatever food the nurses brought her, obsessively monitoring his recovery. On the 4th day, he was awake, alert, and demanding to speak with her. She entered his private hospital room to find him sitting up in bed, looking remarkably well considering that he had been at death's door just days earlier. He still had various monitors attached, and a nurse hovered nearby, but his eyes were clear and his smile was warm. "Dr. Hassan," he said, his voice slightly rough but strong, "they tell me I owe you my life." Layla felt her old shyness return, and she had to resist the urge to look at her feet the way she had as a terrified 17-year-old girl. "I only did what any toxicologist would have done, Your Majesty." "Please sit." He gestured to a chair beside his bed. "And I don't think that's true. Doctor, Al-Rashid explained that you identified a poison that most people would never have caught, then created an antidote that had never existed before, all in less than 12 hours. That's not what any toxicologist could do. That's extraordinary." She sat, her hands folded in her lap, and found herself at a loss for words. How did you speak to a king you had just saved? How did you explain that saving him had felt like the most important thing she would ever do? "I remember you, you know," King Rashid continued, his expression softening. "The tea girl I called you in the ambulance. You probably don't recall the banquet 13 years ago." "I remember every second of it," Layla interrupted, then caught herself. "I apologize for interrupting, Your Majesty." He waved off her apology. "I'm glad you remember. That was a turning point for me as well, you see. I was still young then, still finding my way as Crown Prince, still learning what kind of leader I wanted to be. And in that moment when you spilled the tea, I had a choice to respond with anger, which would have been my father's way, or with kindness, which is what my mother always urged." "You chose kindness," Layla said softly. "You protected me when I was defenseless. You gave me an education I never could have afforded. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. You gave me a future I never dreamed was possible. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished, it all flows from that moment." King Rashid was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Do you know what I thought when I realized I was being poisoned? When I felt my heart starting to fail and I knew I might die? I thought about all the things I still wanted to do for this kingdom, all the progress I still wanted to make. And I thought about you, wondering if you were still in England, if you were happy, if that investment in your education had borne fruit. I thought dying without knowing would be one of my greatest regrets. I came home," Layla said, 3 years ago. "I came home because this kingdom gave me everything and I wanted to give back." "And you did," he replied. "You gave me my life. You gave this kingdom its king. I don't know how to repay such a debt." Layla shook her head firmly. "You don't repay it, Your Majesty. We just pass it forward. You protected me when I was defenseless. Today I return that kindness, and tomorrow I'll train the next generation of toxicologists who might save someone else. That's how kindness works. It multiplies, it spreads, it creates ripples that travel farther than we can ever know." She paused, then added quietly, "Besides, saving you wasn't repaying a debt. It was saving someone I've always admired, someone who represents the best of what leadership can be, someone whose continued life serves thousands of people. You didn't need to earn my help, Your Majesty. You had it simply because you needed it. King Rashid reached out and took her hand, a gesture that would have shocked the palace protocol officers, but felt entirely natural in this moment. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Thank you for your brilliance, your dedication, and your compassion. Thank you for proving that one act of kindness, however small it might seem at the time, can change the world. The investigation into the assassination attempt revealed a complex conspiracy involving a dissident faction opposed to al-Nasr's progressive reforms and a foreign intelligence service that had provided technical expertise. The palace chef, who had added the poison to the king's food, was arrested along with 3 accomplices. The case became an international incident, dominating headlines for months. But for Layla, the important work was just beginning. Her successful creation of an antidote for a previously unknown toxin had proven the value of her rapid response protocols. She worked with the government to establish a new division within the Rashid Center, specifically focused on protecting high-value targets from chemical and biological attacks. We were lucky this time, she told her expanded team at their first meeting. Lucky that I happened to be at the dinner, lucky that I recognized the symptoms quickly enough, lucky that we had the resources and expertise to create an antidote in time. But we can't rely on luck. We need systems, protocols, databases, trained personnel ready to respond to any poisoning incident anywhere in the kingdom. Within 2 years, the Al-Nasra Toxicological Response Network had become a model copied by nations around the world. Layla found herself traveling internationally, lecturing at conferences, training other toxicologists, sharing the protocols that had saved King Rashid's life. And through it all, she maintained a friendship with the king that surprised everyone except those who knew them both well. Once a month, they had tea together, proper tea service which Layla had learned to pour without spilling, and discussed everything from science to philosophy to the challenges of leadership and the responsibilities of expertise. You've become one of my most trusted advisors, King Rashid told her during one of these sessions, 5 years after the assassination attempt. Not just on matters of security, but on how we think about education, about investing in people, about the compounding returns of kindness. Layla smiled. I'm just telling you what you already knew, Your Majesty. You proved it when you chose grace over anger at that banquet. You understood that people are investments, that potential can be cultivated, that sometimes the best thing you can do is give someone a chance. Speaking of which, the king said, leaning forward with the expression he wore when he was about to propose something ambitious, I want to establish a national scholarship program. Full funding for any student who shows promise but lacks resources in any field of study they choose. We'll call it the Second Chance Scholarship, because everyone deserves the opportunity that one moment of kindness gave you. Tears pricked at Layla's eyes. That would change thousands of lives, Your Majesty. Exactly, he replied. One spilled pot of tea changed 2 lives, yours and mine. Imagine what thousands of scholarships could do. Imagine the doctors, the engineers, the teachers, the artists we might discover among those we would otherwise overlook. Imagine the antidotes they might create, the problems they might solve, the kindness they might pass forward. The program was announced the following month, with Dr. Layla Hassan appointed as its director alongside her other responsibilities. The first year, they awarded 250 scholarships. Within 5 years, that number had grown to over 1,000 annually, funded by a combination of government resources and private donations from citizens inspired by the story of the tea girl who became the kingdom's guardian.